This is a thrill to be here with you. We've all been to a number of these events, and I always find it so exciting to see friends, old friends, but also to see people from one end of the country to the other end. We even have international representatives of Jesuit universities here this evening, so this is gaining momentum. Pope Francis, the planet, and our future. Both of those, all three of those words are so important and mean a great deal to me and to you, and I think to all of us. Mary Signalite wasn't here. If you can't hear, do as Mary did, with your ears or whatever. What Pope Francis did was he did the letter that Father Gary referenced, that Laudato Si, I like the English name, Care for Our Common Home. And he wrote that just 4 years ago. He focused on urgent global problems, and there were two. I suspect, a lot of you have read the letter, but the two major problems are climate change and the poor. And of course, climate change really affects the poor more than it does us, frankly. More about that later. His style is easy and accessible. If you pick it up, you'll find that, it's unlike any papal document I've ever read. I'd never read one that was readable before. I mean, honestly, it's engaging. Now, a friend of mine was talking to Cardinal Turkson, who oversaw the writing of the letter, was Pope Francis's material, of course. But he said as Pope Francis there are 6 chapters. As he'd finish one chapter, he'd turn it over to the translators, and he told them, look, put this in the vernacular. Don't try to make it word for word or literal. And as a result, we've got a marvelously readable letter. It also, in preparation for the letter, he did a lot of consulting. He consulted with, he had several groups of scientists, because what we're talking about in climate change is, what are the facts of the case? What is actually happening in terms of the rise in temperature, and what's that effect? And there were several panels before the letter was published. In that, and as a result, not surprisingly, when the letter came out, it was not only praised in Catholic and religious circles, but also praised by, of all people, the scientific community. Both Science, which is the major journal of the American Association of Academy of Science, and Nature, which is the one from the UK, both ran editorials on what a great letter this was. What he's doing is he's challenging the myth that we have unlimited resources and we can continue boundless growth. And he's saying that just isn't true. We've got to take account of where we are and where we're going and what we're about. And the sooner the better. For example, let me give you some examples of what he has said. He says that right in the beginning of the letter, one of the first chapters, he says we live in a throwaway culture. Now, he's not talking about the U.S. here. He was talking about the world. We just throw things away. We don't think about preserving them. And he says we live in a culture of compulsive consumerism. Now, this would be mostly the Western world, of course. We got to buy things. We have new things. We have to have it. And I think he's right on target. Then he says the earth is becoming piled with filth. His words, it's Pope Francis's. And then he says, pollution affects the health of millions, especially of the poor. And then he points out that huge populations have little access to clean water, good drinking. If you don't have access to drinking water, well, you know what happens, clean drinking water. Then he says the unborn are treated with indifference. We just don't care. Again, they're part of our throwaway culture. And thousands of animal species are permitted to fall into extinction. Here, I feel bad. I'm talking to you. You don't even have your main meal yet. I had a chance to eat some of it earlier. But I'm going to continue talking because I think they're going to continue to serve you folks. What are the causes of this? He sees two major causes, one systematic and the other personal. Couple of systematic causes is one, according to Pope Francis, and I think he's onto something, a technocratic paradigm, he calls it. When we have a problem in environmental issues or other issues, we think we can solve it with a technical solution. Well, sometimes it doesn't work. It doesn't work very well. And the other failure, he says, that many people think that we can solve it with the economic paradigm, that unregulated free markets will solve the problem. Just let them go. Well, we know that. I mean, if we're looking around at all, we know that does not work. And he challenges it correctly, I think. But then he sees some personal causes of the problem. That is, our wasteful society and our not paying attention to the poor. And he says that personal is individualism, for example, and self-interest. That we tend to, it's a me-first culture. What's in it for me? Unfortunately, I think our civic political system has gone in that direction. We used to think of the common good. What's good for the community? Well, now people vote in terms of what's good for me. We've really gone far off course when that's the case. And Francis says we need a new, larger view, and he calls it an integral ecology, where it all fits together. We see the world as a whole, the planet as a whole, and that we have a responsibility for it. And one of his recommendations is that we should have civic and political love, that we need one another. Well, I think he's exactly correct. Francis is indeed a prophet. All societies need a prophet. We need a prophet to open up new frontiers, to challenge us to think and reflect and be more conscientious. And we need that. We don't have a prophet today. I'm so thankful for Pope Francis. You look around the world, who else is a moral leader in the world that we live in today? We don't have any. I mean, if not for Pope Francis, where would we be, pointing out the direction of what we ought to be thinking about and what we ought to be doing? So God bless Pope Francis. He bases the letter on a moral foundation, which is twofold. Now, he addressed this to everybody, not just to Christians, not just to Catholics, but to everybody, including world leaders. In fact, before he had just finished the letter, he finished the letter just before the Paris Climate Agreement. And it was after Donald Trump was elected, but before he took office, he visited the Pope in Rome, and Francis gave him a copy of the letter. And the president-to-be said he'd read it. But folks that are looking at the letter now say that he had a major influence on the agreement of some 173 countries around the world at the Paris Climate Agreement, that it pushed many countries to sign, their heads of state, their legislatures, the attitude of peoples. Frankly, that was one of his intentions. He knew that was coming up, and that was one of the reasons that he got the letter out and got it out when he did get it out. Francis, for me, he's a hero, not just because of what he says and what he does, but he walks the talk. And you all know this as well as I do. His lifestyle is one of simplicity. He drives around in a Ford Focus, just like us Jesuits in our Jesuit community, the smallest car we can find. And he refuses to live in the papal apartments. I mean, that. These are lavish, Renaissance. He's living in the visitor center. And, he has meals often with the people who come to the visitor center in the Vatican. And you recall, every Good Friday he washes the feet of people as part of the Good Friday service. He is, and he does this with women, Muslims, Jews, Protestants, everybody. And that's to show his inclusiveness. You know, he really wants to affect and be a leader, you know, for everyone. You know, is he successful? Well, that's a good question. When he was in that first year, I think another indication of his impact is that he, there was a picture of him washing feet, you know, the feet of poor people at the Vatican in St. Peter's on the front page of the New York Times and front page of the Wall Street Journal, pardon me. But then the New York Times also had an editorial which praised Pope Francis. And he's been praised by other religious leaders also. So he's not standing alone, but he does have a voice. And that's a real advantage, I think, of our church structure, you know, in the Catholic Church, that there is a leader who can speak out and speak to important moral and ethical issues. You know, another factor which I think is significant is, I teach in the business school, as I think a lot of you folks know. And his business management style has been praised a number of times. Now, let me give you, you know, some of you are aware of this, I'm sure. But, you know, Chris Lowney, who was one of the first speakers at this event, you know, wrote this book, you know, why Pope Francis, why he leads the way he leads. And he talks about his style and what he does. And, of course, this is after the one he wrote about letters from a 450-year-old company that still is charging ahead. What's that? The Society of Jesus. And you know, and there is a lot of similarity between the way Francis leads and indeed what our constitutions call us to do. Another book which is much more recent is Lead with Humility. 12 leadership lessons from Pope Francis. This is done by a fellow who is Jewish, a victim, his parents were a victim of the Holocaust. It's published by the American Management Association. So it shows the impact that Pope Francis is having way beyond, you know, our Catholic community or even a religious community. Now, I also can't resist telling you that the most recent issue of Business Week really touches on several of these themes. One of them is how climate change is affecting the poorest countries in Africa. Because of drought, their corn crop has dried up and their other crops have dried up, and what do? They aren't getting the water in their dams, so they don't get the electricity. And then in other areas close by, they have torrential rains and cyclones, and they just get washed out. And then another section, another article, which is on how we can redesign cities to make them more humane, if you will. And it quotes a fellow who's done it in Spain on several occasions. There were some critics of Pope Francis's letter. You know what? Some of the critics at the beginning said that, well, he doesn't understand the benefits of free markets and capitalism. Well, that's not true. I mean, if you read the letter, you can see that he acknowledges that markets and capitalism have lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. So he recognizes that. But he is saying that it's got to be directed. It's got to be guided, or we run into problems, and we're running into a lot of them now, as you know. One of them, of course, we just discussed globalization in class yesterday, and frankly, I was amazed at what a hot-button issue globalization has become. You know, it used to be we'd take it for granted, you know, it seemed like a good thing, and we'd lower the cost of goods, and everybody would be better off. Well, not true. But again, it's because we have not looked at the side effects, the negative side effects of globalization, both in the U.S. and in other countries. And as a result, we have this rise in nationalism. Again, not just in the U.S., but boy, you look at UK, in Brazil, Hungary, all around the world, they're drawing up the bridges and becoming more insular. And that's unfortunate. Also, people who criticize the letter, I wonder if, he doesn't understand free markets and capitalism. Have they ever studied economics? I mean, one of the classic issues that economists present, as you folks know, is the tragedy of the commons. And that is that, well, okay, 2 minutes, you've heard it. I mean, it goes back to the days when there was a common area in a city, and you've got your own land that you would graze your land on. Well, which are you going to put them on? You put them on the commons, because then when that's all gone, then you use your own land. Well, that's the tragedy of the commons, that we tend to use public goods and without thinking of the long-term impact. And Francis does call for global regulations. He says we ought to consider that. Now, this is a very hot-button issue. I think we're well aware of this. Of course, the counter-argument is that it brings about a loss of sovereignty in countries. Okay, can we figure that out? Can we wend our way through? Frankly, I think it's absolutely essential that we do it. We've got to figure out how to balance these needs. And then, of course, another major issue that globalization has brought about is the increasing gap between the very wealthy and the poor. And he mentions that. This has been growing for the last generation and a half or 2 generations. And since globalization, it has really skyrocketed. And you've heard the figures, the 1/2 of 1%, of population, their wealth is greater than the bottom 50%. And this is true in country after country now, not just in the U.S. Now, that's a situation where, again, this is coming up publicly, regularly, and we'll have to watch to see what happens. I will say that I've used the letter in class, both with undergrad business students and with MBAers. They find it a very provocative letter and a very stimulating. And many of the students will say, wow, I've got to watch the way I live. I've got to be much more careful with how I use things. I also ask them to figure out their global footprint. Maybe you've done this yourself. It's a fascinating exercise where, you do it online. You can, Google it or Yahoo it. I like Yahoo. Hate to give Google all that monopoly power. But, what you do, they ask you a whole series of questions. How far do you commute? What do you eat? A whole bunch of questions. At the end of it, they tell you how many globes it would take to support the people on this planet with your lifestyle. I mean, it's pretty sobering. I mean, some of the students went up to 5 planets. The lowest was 3 planets. Well, that isn't going to work, and we know that. I mean, we've got to figure out, how to live more simply, more sustainably. And not just us, but the rest of the world also. As you know so well, the U.S. dropped out of the Paris Climate Treaty, and, our president just signed a letter yesterday that would trigger it finally in 1 year. Now, we're the only country out of 173 that a couple others did not sign it. I should have written them down, but they aren't countries that you want to call, your allies. But that's tragic, I think. We used to be thought of as the leader of the free world, the model of democracy, the model of freedom. Well, we're not thought of that way, unfortunately, anymore. Another difficulty that has triggered a lot of this, and this is especially in the U.S., is our individualism. Some years ago, a Swedish sociologist did a study of individualism in 53 countries around the world, on a spectrum between being highly individualistic and highly communitarian, if you want to use that word. In other words, focused on the community. Well, I guess, we wouldn't be surprised that of 53 countries in the world, U.S. is number 1. We have the greatest, strongest sense of individualism in the U.S. Now, I can't help but think there of, you folks have probably read Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. It's a classic book, almost 200 years old. But here's what he said about individualism, and he's the one who coined the term. He noticed that when he came to the U.S. He was French, as you remember. He says, individualism at first only saps the virtue of public life, but in the long run it attacks and destroys all others, and at length is absorbed in downright selfishness. Boy, if that isn't an early warning, and this is 200 years ago, well, it didn't have much of an impact, I think, because we're still, number one in individualism. It is interesting that most Americans now see that there is an urgent need to do something about climate change. 56%, in the latest figures that I saw. And a much higher percentage of younger people feel that way. Well, they're the ones that are going to have to live with the world that we've left behind. So you can't blame them of being a little bit anxious. There are some, Francis is not alone. There have been martyrs to trying to protect our common home. In Brazil, 400 people have lost their lives in trying to protect the Amazon rainforest. These are indigenous people, includes Dorothy Stang, you remember, an American sister, a religious sister. Same thing has happened in other countries. Let me give you some good news. We need that, don't we? One is that, recognizing this need, there is a group called the Catholic Global Climate Movement. And they're both gathering data, and they're also making their voice known. And that's not just in the U.S., it's a global group. It was actually started by a young man in Argentina, but it's in almost every country around the world. Some other good news. China, of all places, has spent $360 billion in 1 year on clean energy, on solar and wind. Now they have to, partly because their cities are in such terrible shape that, of course, that's happening in India today. You've been watching the news with New Delhi. And they were able to create 12 million new jobs. Now, it's also true, to moderate our enthusiasm, they're also building coal-fired power plants because they say, well, we need, more energy. And of course, coal is the worst at emitting carbon. Another bit of good news, at least it was for me, I wish it would have had more of an impact, is a plan by leading Republicans, and they called it a Republican plan on climate change. This is 2 years ago. They suggested, the details of it, they suggested a $40 tax on carbon at the very beginning, at the wellhead or at the mine or wherever it may be. And then obviously this appeals to people who recognize the value of the market system. That increases the price of the fuel we use, the products we use that use a lot of fuel, and it would decrease demand. A plan was actually devised by George Shultz, James Baker, you remember them in the cabinet of George Bush, Larry Summers, who was head of the Council of Economic Advisors, and a whole bunch of people who were heads of the Council of Economic Advisors and economic advisors to Republican presidents have signed on to this plan. Institutional investors are also supporting it. Institutional investors worth $32 trillion are supporting it because they say, if climate changes, this is bad, not just for people and for poor, it's terrible for business, for all of us. It's just bad news. And many firms are pledging zero emissions by 2050. Another, I think, a piece of good news is the Business Roundtable. Just a couple of months ago, this is 181 CEOs of the largest firms in the U.S. signed a statement in which they no longer say that the purpose of a corporation is financial, that it's shareholder value or it's increasing shareholder value. And they say that, no, we have responsibilities to all our stakeholders, to our customers, to our employees, to the community. Well, that was a blockbuster. Yeah, that's why you probably read about it. This was clearly written up in detail in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and every other national media. I think you've been watching this for a while, and I think anybody who does would have to say that right now, business and their initiatives are leading government. Government is not doing much, but business is really taking the initiative in cutting down on greenhouse gases. Well, there are a number of examples of that, but I'm going to quit here in a minute. Like one more example, then a quick comment at the end. And this is just as of about a month ago. A group, the International Association of Jesuit Universities. This is all of the Jesuit universities in the world have a group. Father Mike Garanzini, who had been president of Loyola Chicago, is actually head of that now. They gathered just 10 days ago in New York, a group chaired by he and the dean of the Fordham Business School, and with deans from Jesuit business schools from Africa, Latin America, Asia, the US, Europe, all around the world. And their purpose is to design a new paradigm for business, to back off from this maximizing shareholder value. Now, I talked to Father Mike after the CEO statement, and he says, wow, this really came at an opportune time. This is a 3-year plan. Now, what they would like to do is, and then send it out to all Jesuit business schools around the world. Hopefully, it would change the conversation and open up our horizons and make us think in broader purposes. Last couple of comments. I think basically the point is we're all in this together. Pope Francis is telling us that. Our conscience tells us if we look around, it's not just me, it's not just my community, my family, Detroit, U.S. It's the globe. We are all in this together. Here's some words of Pope Francis, which I think are telling. He says, God always forgives. Human beings sometimes forgive. But when nature is mistreated, she never forgives. Love to hear your questions or comments or whatever.
Thanks, Father Cavanagh. Frank, great talk. When you come up one more, I'd like to know.
Say what?
When you come up one more, I'll just raise my hand.
Okay. Any questions?
Or challenges, that'd be wonderful.
Good afternoon, Father. Class of 1986, and I had Father Cavanagh in 1984, Business Ethics. So thank you. Question, it's more of a comment, is part of the message that gets lost because sometimes it's confused with the message of the radical left. In your comments, you're balancing it with conservative measures, with business leaders and things of that nature. So my comment or my question, one and the same, is how can we remove this whole climate change and these other conservation efforts and make it the message of reasonability and not that of the radical left, which is probably why there's so much pushback from the conservatives on these messages that you're talking about. Thank you.
Yeah, and some people, the Green New Deal, which, okay, they get the subject out there, so we pay attention to it, but they're certainly in a minority. I wouldn't call Pope Francis a new leftist. And of course, as you pointed out, the Republicans, prestigious Republicans, on the Economic Council of Republican presidents are saying this too. I think if we allow these issues to be framed by, let me say it, politicians, who want us to think in a certain way, we're not going to get anywhere. Each of us has a responsibility and a conscience to look at them independently. I think a lot of us don't always do that, and I think that's tragic. That we listen to MSNBC or Fox News for our news, or worse, Twitter. I mean, that's not news. Now, I'll give you my bias. My news sources are NPR and public broadcasting, and I think they at least try to be balanced, and try to give both sides of issues. So I recommend them to you. Thank you.
Father Rick Damon, class of 68 and 73. I really liked your addressing that business roundtable led by Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase. And I think they really emphasized that shareholders are critical, but so are the other stakeholders, employees, customers, suppliers, the government regulatory agencies, and the communities. And I think it's the task, as you pointed out, is long-term thinking. Would you agree with that? That's really the thrust. All those short-term, profit-oriented bonuses and disaster of '08, do you really believe they're taking a longer-term approach to this?
I think this depends on the firm, Rick. In some firms, they are. We criticize the financial, firms for only looking at the short term to increase, their bundle of shares in their endowment or in their pension funds. But some of them are really taking the initiative and trying to look at the long term and actually pushing private sector firms in looking at the long term. Now, it's a mixed bag. And I guess that's, a democracy. We're all mixed bags. And some firms are very responsible and are really looking at the long term, and some aren't. Although the number that are looking at the long term is increasing every day. And I find that consoling. Sure. Oh, pardon, yeah, you got them.
Carol Dubin, retired faculty member from the University of Detroit Mercy.
Oh.
We worked together on the consolidation. But I wanted to say something nice. My daughter Lee graduated from the University of Detroit Mercy, and right now she's living in Beirut, Lebanon. And she's working there doing a feasibility study about sustainability for the government. So nice things happen to those of us who are in education when we see our students go on and do useful and wonderful things for government and for the people. So I think all of us who are in education here today and with the Jesuit mission know that good things are happening on our behalf. Thank you. Thank everyone.
Good words.
Thank you. I would like to begin by saying this is also good news, but it's a brag for the IHM sisters. Back in around the year turn of the century, we had our mother house and other buildings falling down. There was a fan playing on the circuit board for the electricity because it was overheating. So what happened was, it wasn't just the superiors who made a decision. They called all of us together to say, what should we do? And it took us several years to figure it out. But what we wound up doing was going green. And the contractor that we hired didn't know how to be green. So we, together with him and with the trades who came in, learned how to do it. And the sisters kept quietly and respectfully insisting that this is the thing we've chosen and this is what we'll do. I recommend all of you to make a visit to the Monroe campus to see the results. We put in a thermal field for the heating and cooling. We have air conditioning now, which we never had. And we have very comfortable heating, which we sort of had. But what happened to the cost of those things, we recouped the cost of doing that in 6 years. So there's a huge payoff for doing this thing, which seems so stupid because you don't do it cheaply, but it works.
Good work.
Yet another example, institutional, is Loyola University, Chicago. In fact, Father Mike Garanzini says, I'm a true believer in trying to save. And I won't give you all of the details of what they've done, but if you go there, they've got a new college of environmental studies that they've established. That's only one. They've done a lot of on-the-ground things, too.
Oh, here.
I wondered if you could just comment from your perspective in the field of business on the potential for change. One approach is, maybe this reflects our American individualism, that each person has to be more aware in their own lifestyle, the choices they make, and how you run your household and so forth. But another approach looks at systemic issues that we're really not going to get anywhere without policy changes at the macro level. How do you see, from your standpoint, working in the business area, the interplay between what each of us might be able to do in our homes with our families and what has to happen at larger levels?
You know, Pope Francis talks about this in the letter. He goes into some detail of what we can do as individuals. For example, one of the things he says is we use air conditioning too much, and the energy that it takes is pretty, astronomical. But I think to the basic point, you're exactly right, Gary, and that is that that's not enough. We've got to have really government regulations and government support. I respect businesses that are taking leadership on this because there is upfront costs, and it may increase their costs. But they're saying no, they realize that this is for the good of all of us in the long run. But then you get the problem of free riders. The other firms or businesses that don't do it, then it's going to be cheaper for them to operate. That's why we need some kind of regulations. And frankly, that's why Pope Francis says we need some kind of international agreements. Now, the closest thing we've come to that is the Paris Climate Agreement, which, 173 nations signed. They set their own targets. They committed to reducing carbon emissions by certain dates. Now, there's no teeth in it, unfortunately, except embarrassment. You can say, well, these countries did do it and these countries didn't do it. But but at least it's a first step. We're in a world where countries don't want to cede any of what they call sovereignty. Every country wants to control what happens within its borders. Okay, and we can appreciate that, but these are big problems that demand, some kind of global solutions. Now, can we do it? I don't know. All I can do is pray. I urge you folks to do the same.
Thank you, Father.